The restaurant had prepared a table for 8, but only one man showed up. By 7:30 that evening, the candles had already burned low. The balloons tied to the corner booth had begun to droop, and the small chalkboard near the entrance still read in cheerful white letters, "Happy birthday, Frank." But Frank sat alone, staring at 8 untouched plates, each one set carefully for people who had promised they were coming. He adjusted his old silver watch for the 3rd time, forcing a smile every time the front door opened, only for that smile to quietly die again. At the bar, a broad-shouldered biker with a gray beard and tired eyes noticed everything. And when he overheard the old man whisper to the waitress, "Please, go ahead and cancel the rest of the reservations. I don't think my family is coming," something inside him broke. Before we go deeper into this unforgettable story, take 1 second to like this video, comment where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel if you believe kindness and second chances can still change lives. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that no one should ever feel forgotten. Franklin Hayes had spent most of his life being the kind of man people depended on. At 72, his shoulders were still straight, his hands still steady, though thinner now, marked by age and years of hard work. For 40 years, he had owned a small hardware store in town, the kind of place where people came not just for nails and tools, but for advice, conversation, and trust. He remembered birthdays, fixed broken toys for neighborhood kids, and often let struggling customers pay later when money was tight. People called him dependable, solid, old-fashioned. His wife, Margaret, used to call him her safe place. She had died 5 years earlier after a quiet battle with cancer, and since then the house had never sounded the same. Silence had moved into every room like an unwelcome tenant. The laughter was gone. The smell of her tea was gone. Even the garden she loved seemed to bloom less brightly. Still, Frank tried. He called his children every Sunday. He never missed a grandchild's birthday. He mailed cards, attended graduations, sent checks tucked into envelopes with handwritten notes. He told himself that busy lives explained missed calls and delayed visits. People were busy. That's what he told himself. This birthday dinner had mattered more than he admitted. His daughter Emily had suggested it 3 weeks ago. She said everyone would come. Her husband, the twins, his son Daniel flying in from Chicago, even his youngest grandson who had just started college. "A dad this year, we're doing it properly," she had said. No excuses. Frank believed her. For the first time in years, he bought a new blazer. He got a haircut. He even drove by the cemetery that morning to visit Margaret and tell her with a smile that the family was finally getting together again. He had reserved the nicest private booth at Miller's Grill, the same restaurant where he and Margaret celebrated their 25th anniversary. At 6:30, he arrived early. At 6:45, he ordered water and checked his phone. At 7, he got the first text, running a little late. At 7:10, another, "Traffic is terrible." At 7:20, another, "Might not make it tonight, Dad. So sorry." And then the silence, no calls, no apologies, just silence. Across the room, the biker watched. His name was Jack Turner, 58, a mechanic by trade and a man most people judge before speaking to. Leather vest, scar across his jaw, hands rough as gravel. He rode with a small veterans motorcycle club that people in town either respected or feared, depending on what rumors they preferred. But Jack had learned long ago that pain wore many disguises. He had come to Miller's alone too, though by choice. Birthdays were difficult for him. They reminded him of his daughter, Sophie, who would have turned 30 that year if a drunk driver hadn't taken her at 19. Since then, celebrations felt like unfinished prayers. He sat with black coffee instead of beer, watching Frank shrink smaller in that oversized booth. When the old man finally asked the waitress to clear the extra settings, his voice barely rose above the clinking glasses around them. Jack looked down at his own hands. He remembered hospital hallways, empty chairs, people saying they'd come and never did. Loneliness recognized loneliness. He stood up. The waitress, Maria, looked surprised when Jack walked over and quietly asked, "That gentleman over there, what's his bill tonight?" She frowned. Jack, just tell me." She sighed softly. "It's not about the bill." "I know." Jack glanced at Frank, now pretending to study the dessert menu so no one would notice his eyes were wet. "Then maybe it's about making sure he doesn't leave remembering this as the night nobody came." Maria said nothing for a moment. Then she smiled the sad kind of smile only kind people know. Within 15 minutes, Jack had made 3 phone calls. At first, it sounded ridiculous even to him. Drop what you're doing. I need a favor. To his best friend Mike from the riding club. To Teresa, owner of the flower shop next door. To Reverend Collins from the local church. He didn't explain much, just enough. There's an old man spending his birthday alone, and I'm not letting that stand. People responded faster than he expected. Maybe because kindness spreads quicker than people think. Maybe because everyone, somewhere deep down, fears being frank one day. By 8 o'clock, the door to Miller's Grill opened again. Frank looked up, expecting maybe, finally, his daughter. Instead, a woman he barely recognized from church walked in carrying a small cake. Then Mike arrived, still in his work boots. Then Teresa with yellow flowers. Then Reverend Collins. Then 3 more bikers. Then Maria's teenage son still wearing his school jacket. Then the retired mailman. Then Mrs. Jensen from across Frank Street. People kept coming. Not family by blood, but people who had known him. People he had once helped. People who remembered. Frank stared like a man watching rain fall in a desert. Jack approached last, awkward and uncertain. He wasn't good at soft moments. He rubbed the back of his neck and said, "Heard there was a birthday party." Was a birthday party. Figured no one should celebrate alone. For a second, Frank couldn't speak. His lips trembled. His eyes filled so quickly he had to look down. Then he stood, slowly, carefully, and shook Jack's hand with both of his. That was when the tears came. Not loud, not dramatic, just the quiet kind that carry years inside them. The restaurant changed that night. The empty booth became warm with laughter. Chairs were borrowed from nearby tables. Someone ordered too much pie. Someone started telling old stories about Frank fixing a bicycle chain in the middle of a thunderstorm 30 years ago. Reverend Collins reminded everyone how Frank once paid a widow's heating bill without signing his name. Even strangers leaned in to listen. For the first time in years, Frank laughed so hard he had to remove his glasses to wipe his eyes. And in the middle of it all, he looked at Jack and said something simple. "You gave me my family back tonight." Jack nearly answered, but his throat closed first. Because the truth was, Frank had done something for him too. He had reminded him that grief did not have to be the final chapter, that sometimes healing walked in wearing unexpected shoes. Weeks passed, but the story didn't end there. Something shifted after that birthday. Frank stopped waiting by the phone and started living again. Every Thursday, he joined Jack and a few others for breakfast at the diner near the highway. At first, he felt out of place among bikers and grease-stained mechanics, but soon he became the center of the table, telling stories, giving advice, and pretending not to enjoy their terrible jokes. Jack started helping Frank around the house on weekends. They fixed the back fence, repainted the porch, planted roses near Margaret's garden. Neither man said it aloud, but both understood they were saving each other. Then, one rainy Sunday afternoon, Frank's daughter Emily showed up. She stood on his porch looking smaller than he remembered. No polished excuses, no rushed smile. Just guilt. She admitted the truth through tears. Life had become selfish, convenient, distracted. She kept assuming there would always be another dinner, another birthday, another chance. Until she saw photos online from that night, her father surrounded by strangers who treated him better than his own children had. And shame hit her like a storm. Frank listened quietly. Age had taught him something pride never could. Forgiveness matters more than being right. He did not erase the hurt, but he opened the door, because love, real love, is often choosing to leave the door unlocked. Slowly, the family returned. Not perfectly, not all at once, but honestly. Sunday dinners started again. Grandchildren visited. Emily called without needing something first. Daniel flew in 2 months later and cried the moment he hugged his father. Healing looked messy, but it looked real. And every year after that, Frank celebrated his birthday at the same restaurant. Only now the reservations kept growing. One table became 2, then 3. Family, friends, neighbors, bikers, church members, old customers, new faces. Every year Jack sat at the head of the table beside him, pretending he hated the singing and secretly requesting extra cake. The chalkboard still read "Happy Birthday, Frank," but now it meant something bigger. It meant remembered, it meant chosen, it meant love. And maybe that is what we are all hoping for in the end. Not grand success, not perfect lives, but simply to know that if we sit at the table, someone will come. Before we finish, if this story touched your heart even a little, please like this video, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to the channel so more people can hear stories that remind us what truly matters. And I have one special request for you. Please comment below. No one eats alone if you believe kindness can still change someone's life, because somewhere tonight someone is sitting at a table wondering if they've been forgotten. Let's remind them they haven't. On Frank's 75th birthday, after the laughter had faded and the candles were gone, he stood outside Miller's Grill under the soft yellow streetlights. Jack stood beside him, arms crossed against the cool night air. Inside, people were still cleaning up. His grandchildren were arguing over leftover cake. Emily was helping Maria stack chairs. Life, loud and imperfect, carried on behind the windows. Frank looked up at the sky and smiled. He thought of Margaret. He thought of the lonely man he had been. And he thought of the biker who had simply decided that a stranger's sadness mattered. Sometimes miracles do not arrive like lightning. Sometimes they arrive on a motorcycle, wearing old leather, carrying nothing but the decision to care. Frank placed a hand on Jack's shoulder and said quietly, "A best birthday of my life." And for once, neither man looked away. The years moved forward, but some nights stayed alive forever. For Frank, that birthday dinner became the dividing line of his life. The night before and the night after. Before, he had lived like a man waiting at a window, hoping someone would remember him. After, he lived like a man who finally understood that love sometimes comes from places you never expected. At 76, Frank sold the hardware store. It was not an easy decision. That little shop had been part of his soul for 4 decades. Every shelf held memories. Every customer who walked through the bell-ringing front door carried a chapter of his life. But his knees ached more than they used to, and Jack kept reminding him that retirement was not surrender. It was permission. So on his final day, half the town showed up. Old customers brought photographs. Former employees hugged him like family. Someone even brought the rusted bicycle he had repaired for free 20 years earlier. Frank stood behind the register one last time, smiling through tears as he handed the keys to a young couple eager to keep the place alive. That evening, Jack drove him out past the edge of town on his motorcycle. Not fast, because Frank complained loudly the entire time. And they stopped at the hill overlooking the river where the sunset turned the water gold. Frank laughed as he climbed off, straightening his jacket like Steve. "At my age," he said, "this counts as reckless behavior." Jack smirked. "You need more of it." They sat there in silence for a while, watching the sky burn orange. Then Frank said something he had never admitted aloud. "I used to be angry at Margaret for leaving first." Jack turned slightly but said nothing. Frank stared ahead. "I know that sounds terrible. I loved her more than anything. But after she was gone, I'd sit in that house and think, how dare you leave me here alone with all this silence?" His voice cracked. "And then I'd hate myself for thinking it." Jack nodded slowly. A grief makes people honest in ugly ways. Frank gave a sad smile. "I spent years thinking loneliness was punishment. Like maybe I had failed somehow. Maybe I wasn't enough for people to stay." Jack took a long breath before answering. "When Sophie died, I thought the same thing." "What's a little sore?" "I thought if I had been a better father, maybe I would have picked her up that night. Maybe I would have changed the ending." He looked down at his rough hands. "But pain lies to you. It tells you abandonment means unworthiness. It tells you silence means you didn't matter." "Ha ha ha ha." He looked directly at Frank. "It's not true." The old man's eyes filled. "No," he whispered. "It's not." That was the first time they spoke openly about the people they had lost. And from that day on, something even deeper formed between them. Not friendship alone, but the kind of bond built when two people help carry each other's ghosts. Months later, winter arrived hard and early. One December morning, Jack didn't show up for breakfast. Frank waited. No call. No message. No message. By noon, worry sat heavy in his chest. He drove to Jack's small house near the garage and found his truck still parked outside. The porch light was on. Snow gathered at the steps. Frank knocked. Nothing. He knocked again. Harder. Still nothing. Panic rose fast. With help from the neighbor, they forced the door open. Jack was on the kitchen floor. He had collapsed from a heart attack sometime that morning. The ambulance came fast, too loud. Frank rode behind it with shaking hands gripping the steering wheel, whispering prayers he had not spoken in years. Hospitals had a cruel way of making time feel suspended. The same smell, the same white walls, the same helpless waiting. Frank sat there for hours, staring at the ICU doors, feeling once again like the loneliest man alive. Only this time, he wasn't alone. Emily came. Daniel flew in. Maria brought coffee. The bikers arrived one by one until the waiting room looked like a leather convention. Even Reverend Collins sat quietly with folded hands, because this was what Jack had built without realizing it. He had spent years believing he was just surviving, but he had been creating family. Late that night, the doctor finally came. Jack had survived, barely, but he would live. Frank sat down so suddenly the nurse thought he might faint. He laughed and cried at the same time, covering his face with both hands. At 76 years old, he discovered something surprising. You were never too old to be terrified of losing your best friend. Recovery was slow. Jack hated every second of it. He hated the hospital food, the machines, the lectures, and especially everyone telling him to rest. Frank visited every single day. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they argued. Sometimes they just sat in silence watching old baseball games neither of them really cared about. One afternoon, Jack looked at him and said, "You know, for a guy who used to eat birthday cake alone, you've become annoyingly difficult to get rid of." Frank smiled. It's the plan. When Jack finally came home, the entire street was waiting. Neighbors had decorated the porch. Someone hung a ridiculous banner that read, "Welcome back, old man." The bikers revved their engines like a parade. Maria cried openly, and Frank stood at the center of it all, smiling like a proud brother. Life, once so quiet, had become beautifully loud. Spring came softer. Margaret's roses bloomed stronger than ever. Frank's youngest grandson, Liam, started visiting every Saturday to learn how to work with tools in the garage. They built birdhouses, repaired old chairs, and talked about life in the slow, honest way only grandparents and grandchildren can. One afternoon, Liam asked, "Oh, Grandpa, were you ever scared of getting old?" Frank thought for a moment. Then he answered truthfully, "No. I was scared of becoming invisible." The boy frowned. "Did you?" Frank looked toward the garden where Jack was badly pretending to know how to prune roses. He smiled. "Oh, for a little while, but then people reminded me I wasn't." That summer, Frank made a decision. He used part of the money from selling the hardware store to start something called Margaret's Table. Every Friday night at Miller's Grill, anyone in town who would otherwise eat alone, widows, widowers, veterans, students, far from home, elderly neighbors, single parents, could come for dinner. No cost, no questions, just a seat at the table. At first, only 6 people came, then 12, then 30. Then so many that Maria had to reserve half the restaurant. The idea spread. Local businesses donated meals, church groups volunteered, teenagers served food. People who arrived as strangers left exchanging phone numbers and holiday invitations. On the wall near the entrance, beneath the birthday chalkboard, they hung a small wooden sign. It read, "No one eats alone." Frank stood beneath that sign one evening, watching a young widow laugh for the first time in months, watching an old veteran tell stories to college students who listened like grandchildren, watching Jack argue with the cook about pie portions. And he felt Margaret there somehow, not in sadness, in warmth, in continuation, in proof that love, when given freely, does not end, it multiplies. Before we reach the ending of this story, if your heart feels something right now, please take a moment to like this video and share it. Stories like this survive because people choose to pass them forward. And please, comment below. Kindness finds its way back. Because sometimes one small act changes generations. On Frank's 80th birthday, Miller's Grill had to close the entire restaurant for the celebration. There were too many people. His children, grandchildren, neighbors, church members, bikers, old customers, new friends, and dozens of people from Margaret's Table filled every seat. The chalkboard still stood near the entrance. "Happy birthday, Frank." But someone had added another line underneath. "Thank you for never letting us eat alone." When the cake arrived, everyone stood singing loudly and terribly off-key. Frank looked around the room, overwhelmed. Years ago, he had sat in this same place believing he had been forgotten. Now he could barely find enough time to hug everyone. When the singing ended, he raised his glass with trembling hands. He looked first at his family, then at Jack, then at the crowded room full of proof that life could surprise you even after heartbreak. His voice was quiet, but every person heard it. I thought getting older meant losing people. And sometimes it does. But no one tells you that if you keep your heart open, life can also bring people back. Not always the same people. Sometimes better, sometimes exactly who you needed. Tears filled more eyes than his own. I was alone once, and I believe that was how my story would end. I was wrong, because one man decided to walk across a restaurant and remind me I mattered. He looked at Jack, and because of that, I got more life than I thought I had left. Jack shook his head like he hated attention, but he was crying too. Frank smiled. So if anyone here ever wonders whether small kindness matters, let me answer for you. It does. It saves people, sometimes quietly, sometimes forever. There was silence, then applause, long, loud, and full of love. And somewhere in that noise, Frank felt peace, not because life had become perfect, but because he finally understood this truth. Family is not only who arrives by blood. Sometimes family is the stranger who notices your empty chair and refuses to let you sit there alone.